if we're going to emulate what Christ did towards other people, we can call them our friends. We're going to have to die to self. Mm-hmm. We should be striving to live full of the Spirit, and by so doing, emulate the life of Christ. I think when we do that, there are people going to be drawn to us who want to be our friend. When people see us, they should see Christ. Everybody's not going to respond to us with friendship when we live out the life of Christ. But for some, we will change their life. We will change their world by showing them Christ.
As the culture turns its back on God, many Christians are missing out on the fulfilling life God has for His people. That's why we created the Innerfire Podcast. Join me, Andrew Carroll, and my dad, Scotty, as we confront modern complexities with timeless truth so that you can be equipped to live out the Word. We hope this podcast is a blessing to you. All right, we're continuing our conversation about friendship today. In our last couple of conversations, we talked about what a friend is, why we should have friends, how friends might lead us astray. And we went through a lot of what the Bible says about friends, a lot of the wisdom contained in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, but also some examples of friendship that we see in the Bible, especially David and Jonathan. But then some negative examples too, with Jonadab and Amnon and other such characters. So we want to move on now, and I think that the first thing we need to get into is, do we need to talk about friends in kind of a different sense? Because I feel like the way we've been talking about friends up until this point is as a reciprocal relationship. This is a sort of traditional sense of the word. When people think my friends, they think of people that they like to be around, maybe that they even admire and respect and whatnot. But as Christians, are we called to show ourselves friendly to a wider group of people than that?
Yeah, I think we definitely are. And I think it's a conversation worth having. We spent a lot of time talking about who is my friend in the first episode that was about this. But I think we can look at that, as you say, from a little bit different lens than what we were looking before. Because when Jesus was here, I don't think he looked at friendship as a reciprocal relationship. I mean, he was God, so
right.
What are you going to reciprocate to that?
Right.
But I think he modeled both cases with his disciples, especially his inner circle of his disciples. But I think it's worth us looking at and basically asking again the question, "Who is my friend?" Mm-hmm. And I think the story in the Bible that comes to mind when I think of that is the story of the Good Samaritan. And I know that story typically uses the word neighbor, but I think it's representative of how we can think about people as our friends and how we should interact and care for people. So if you got that, it might be worthy of just reading that story again.
Yeah, so a man asked Jesus, basically, who is my neighbor? Jesus is talking about loving your neighbor, and we like to split hairs in order to alleviate some burden. And Jesus tells him this parable. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal, and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And the man answered, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. And that statement there, who do you think proved to be a neighbor? We could insert the word friend there. Who was a friend to the man?
Yeah, I think the key thing there is Jesus said, go and do likewise.
Right.
I mean, that was the direct command to this guy who was seeking eternal life, was to find the people that need help and serve them. And by so doing, you would be a friend to them. And so that's a little bit of a different angle than what we talked about before, from a friendship being a reciprocal arrangement. And I think, if you look at it in the bigger picture of Christianity, serving others is what we are called to do, because that's what Jesus did. Jesus basically stepped out of heaven, took upon himself the form of mankind, being God, who, he thought it not robbery to be equal with God, came down, and he said he took on himself the form of a servant. That's what he did when he was here, was to serve other people. And I believe we could think of those people that he's serving as his friends. We talked about last time, he was accused of being a friend of publicans and sinners, because often he extended a hand to them. It wasn't an effort ultimately to bring salvation to them. It wasn't the kind of friendship like we talked about a lot in the previous podcast. And so I think we have to examine ourselves and say, am I willing to be a friend to those who cannot reciprocate that friendship to me?
Right. And that just calls to mind this statement in the Sermon on the Mount. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Man, when you talk about the friendship that Jesus showed to humanity, you're immediately confronted with the most challenging view of friendship. It's easy to love and be friends with the people that you like, that you admire, that you respect, but to do the same to people who you don't like, who get on your nerves. You don't admire them, you don't respect them, and even more, that may be your enemy, that may be actively against you in some way. Jesus even loved those people. And even though we think of ourselves as friends of God, at one time we were enemies of God, right? While we were yet sinners, he died for us. Right. So Jesus didn't wait around until we became likable to make himself a friend to us. So that is a great challenge for us to, go and sit with the unpopular person, go and do something nice for the person who gets under your skin. Like, this is the Christian way.
Well, it's the great challenge of Christianity to be something beyond what we are naturally, right? I mean, that's the thing that I've told people about Christianity for a long time. It goes against everything that is in us naturally. Yeah. It is not naturally in us to serve those who cannot reciprocate. It's not in us to befriend our enemies. It's not, just when Jesus took on himself the form of a servant, we don't like to serve other people. Right? I mean, our natural tendency is to have other people serve us. I mean, that's what, that's kind of what we prefer. And so I think we have to just understand, if we're going to live out the word, that is not going to come natural to us. We're going to have to seek the Spirit, seek to be full of the Spirit, if we're going to produce the fruit of the Spirit, which does not come naturally to us. And so, that's what I would encourage people to think about, is you can't just walk through this life doing what comes natural, because that will produce, not the fruit of the Spirit. It's just works of the flesh, right?
Right.
And so that's how we need to be. That's how we need to be approaching life.
I think that this is one of the strongest arguments in favor of the veracity of Christianity, is that it is a religion that no one could ever think up. Mm-hmm. It does not occur to the natural mind to live in this way that we're talking about, to live as Jesus lived, especially, who was himself God and humbled himself to such a degree to walk among us, then to be unjustly crucified. And why? For people that were his enemies at the time that he did it. All of these things just fly in the face of the wisdom of the world, right? Mm-hmm. And yet we see that it is a much deeper and much truer and more profound wisdom.
Well, and if you look back at that verse I was quoting there in Philippians, when Jesus thought not to be robbery with God, took on himself the form of a servant, it goes on to say, and he was obedient unto death.
Yeah.
And there's also, we know the verse where Jesus said, hey, there's no greater love than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. Mm-hmm. Well, if we're going to serve others, we have to die to ourselves. That's just the reality of the situation. Sometimes we serve other people because we get something out of it. Maybe we get status, maybe it makes us feel good or whatever. Mm-hmm. But truly serving other people, expecting nothing in return, requires us to die to ourselves. And that is what Christianity really is about, is, I have died to myself. I am dead. Nevertheless, I live, right? But it's Christ that lives in me.
Right.
And so if we're going to emulate what Christ did towards other people, we can call them our friends. We're going to have to die to self. Mm-hmm. We should be striving to live full of the Spirit, and by so doing, emulate the life of Christ. Mm-hmm. I would make the argument that if we're doing that, if we are, when people see us, they should see Christ. That should be the goal of when we live out the Word, the Word being Jesus Christ himself, what we're essentially saying is we're going to show Christ to the world by how we live. And I think when we do that, there are people going to be drawn to us who want to be our friend. One question people might have is, how do I make friends, or how do I find friends? Well, Jesus didn't have any trouble finding friends. Now, he also found people that wanted to kill him and that did kill him. He found people who opposed him vehemently, and we will find those same people as well. Everybody's not going to respond to us with friendship when we live out the life of Christ. But for some, we will change their life. We will change their world by showing them Christ.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, you want to talk about making friends. Jesus made friends in the sense that he turned enemies into friends, right? Mm-hmm. He loved them and sacrificed for them to such a degree that he won them, in a sense. Mm-hmm. Now, you were talking about putting on the Spirit of Christ and living as if, Christ were living through you. Well, okay, what does that mean? The Spirit of Christ is the Spirit that says, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do, as they're crucifying you, right? It's a sort of radical self-forgetfulness, right?
Well, it is radical. Being a Christian should be radical.
Right.
It's just the facts of the matter. Nobody wants to be called a radical. Mm-hmm. But if we're living like Christ, it will look radical to the world. And we don't like that.
Yes,
we
definitely.
don't want to be a radical. We want to fit in. Mm-hmm. Even when we go to church, we want to fit in, right? We want to look like the other Christians. Mm-hmm. And so I think if we want to truly be a friend to other people, as the Good Samaritan, as we call him, was, then we're going to just have to accept the fact that we're not going to look like other people, especially the world, but sometimes even Christians, because we're going to be radical in what we do. And, I think if you look back to that story of the Good Samaritan, I think, the question's going to come up. I mean, okay, who do I help then? Do I help everybody I see? Okay, this guy that was in the ditch and I cared for his wounds and paid for his hotel bill. How long do I keep doing that? We are practical people.
Sure.
And so we like to ask a lot of practical questions.
Well, that's just like the guy who said, who's my neighbor, right? We want to get into all the little particulars that will absolve us.
That's it. We want to absolve ourselves. Mm-hmm. And, I'm just hearing voices in my head. Well, there's common sense to be applied here. We can't deflate ourselves of time and money and resources and energy and everything else by caring for everybody we run into who's got a need. Mm-hmm. And, I say, yeah, that's true. I think about the story when Jesus went to the pool of Bethesda. And there was, if you read the story, there was a group of people there. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There were a group of people there that wanted to get into the water and be healed. For whatever reason, Jesus singled out one of them. Mm-hmm. That's always been a curious thing in my mind, is He didn't just say, okay, everybody here, gather up here and I'm gonna heal you. Jesus dealt with that one guy, which typically He deals with individuals like that. And so I don't think it's our job to solve all the world's problems. We don't have the time, energy, nor the resources to do that. Mm-hmm. But as Jesus, what did Jesus say? Jesus said, I am doing the will of the Father. What I speak is what the Father has spoken to me.
Right.
He was very specific about hearing the Father speak through the Spirit and doing that. And I think that's what we cannot absolve ourselves of. The question we have to ask is, are we listening to the Spirit? Are we looking for that one guy that's by the pool that needs help? Mm-hmm. And are we passing over him, or are we just lumping him, or are we singling him out to help?
Right. It's very easy to get conveniently lost in moral confusion, right? Mm-hmm. Here's my thought on this. Just do what you already know is right. Like, there are going to be plenty of things that you're confused about at any point in your life. Well, should I do this? Should I do this? Should I do this? But there are also going to be many things that okay, I absolutely should do this. I absolutely should not do this. And my sense is that people are happier to occupy themselves contemplating these sort of complex questions of morality rather than practicing the righteousness that is plain to them. My sense is that if you faithfully practice the righteousness that's plain to you, that is what grows your powers of discernment. And I think that there's support for that in Scripture. I can't remember the exact word. I'll pull it up here in just a minute. But in the context of friendship, don't worry about who at the pool of Bethesda am I going to direct my attention towards. Just direct your attention towards somebody. Find someone who you can give to who cannot give it back to you. Anyone, and just start there. And don't tie yourself down with all of these unanswerable questions. And, call yourself wise when you're just practicing self-deception.
Well, I think the unanswerable questions, one of the unanswerable questions would be, how much of my life do I devote to this? Because especially here in the United States, we tend to be very busy people. Mm-hmm. And especially if we have kids, they're involved in a lot of things. Unless we're just a retired person sitting at home and don't have a hobby and don't have friends we're out doing things with. I mean, I know some people who are retired who are busier than they were when they were working, and then I know some retired people who wish they had more to do. But unless we fit into that category, then, one question that, I ask myself and that other people say is, okay, how much time can I devote to doing this? Because I've got to go to work and I've got to spend time with my wife. Y'all told us on the marriage podcast that was important. And you told me I got to, spend time with my friends with my kids. There's no substitute for the time spent with them. And so, there's only 24 hours in a day. I got to sleep sometime. So, just a practical question is, how much time do I devote to this? I don't think it's an answerable question per se. I think the answer really is, as you are going is when you do it, right? I don't think Jesus necessarily, or maybe he did because he's God, but I think he was going somewhere when he went to the pool of Bethesda, and I think he passed by there. The woman at the well, they were on their way to somewhere when he ran into the woman at the well. I think God will open the doors and put those people in our way as we go if we are looking for them. But if we're not looking for them, if we're just self-absorbed into what we're doing, which is the natural mode of man, then we will pass right by without seeing it. Just like the first, the first two people in this Good Samaritan story, there's some other implications there we won't get into about them being religious and all that. I mean, Jesus, when he told a story, he did it right. But we could just look at it and say, one excuse that both of those guys could have used is, I don't have time to deal with this. I got places to be. It's not my fault the guy wound up in the ditch. It's not my fault that he was beaten and robbed.
Yeah, not my problem.
Yeah, I've got an appointment I've got to get to. Somebody else will deal with it, or he'll figure it out. That's not the approach we need to take. We need to not be so busy that we can't stop and help other people.
Yes. If you're too busy to help your fellow man, then you're too busy. The question, how much time should we devote to this? When you stand before Almighty God one day and he says, why didn't you go help this person? Well, that would have cut into my Monday night football time is not a good answer. So the first place to look when you're trying to find time to devote to the lives of other people is time that you're just dedicating to yourself, right? Now, does that mean that football time is off limits and whatnot? Well, we'll talk about that some other time. But what we're talking about today is how you need to be doing something. You need to be doing more than you want to. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say too, I think we need to keep in mind, Jesus said, if you have done it unto the least of these, you have done it unto me.
Right.
So, we talked a little bit previously about, is God our friend? Is Jesus our friend? Well, if you are serving others, you are being a friend of God, because if you do it unto the least of these, you have done it unto God.
Right.
And so I think we need to keep that in mind. A lot of people ask questions like, how do I love God? How do I serve God? God's this, person up in heaven that I can't see or is maybe distant from me. We serve him, we love him by loving our fellow man, and especially the least of these that are among us.
I was riding down the road with my wife and we were talking about a friend of ours who we have helped a lot, who is in a worse situation now than when we met them. And the question is, has any of our help to this person been useful? Has it all gone to waste? And I thought of that verse, what you've done to the least of these, you've done unto me. Insofar as we did it for our friend, we did it for Christ himself. And in that sense, it cannot be wasted, right? Now, does that take the burden off of you to be a good steward with your time and with your resources, with your talents? No, it doesn't. You still need to exercise wisdom in those sorts of decisions. But there comes a point where you cannot let your fear of negative consequences hold you back from doing what the Lord has commanded you to do, right? But rather just leave it in his hands. And if you're concerned about, well, if I just love that freely, how will there be anything left for me? Like, how will I get on? Well, the Lord is there to restore to you 100-fold whatever you've sacrificed for him. That's what the scripture says.
Well, the other thing it says too is Jesus said, "You are my friend when you obey my commands," right? So you want to be a friend of Jesus, obey what he said, which goes back to, the story we read there about the Good Samaritan. Just prior to what you read, the verse was quoted, I believe, of, we should love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. That's where the question came from. Well, who is my neighbor?
Right.
And so that is the command of God. And if we want to be a friend of God, a friend of Jesus, that is the command that we should be obeying. All the law and the prophets are wrapped up in those two things right there. Love God, love your neighbor, love the people, view the people as your friends. If we're talking about friendship, but we're talking kind of an expanded view of what we talked about earlier in the other podcast. So the thing I think we have to be careful about, I think you're still young, and you haven't had all the, I guess, negative experiences that I've had in life, which is wonderful, because I have a lot more negative experiences, you might say, to overcome. When I see the guy in a ditch, I'm like, yeah, you're just like the other 100 I've seen in a ditch.
Right.
As we get older, we tend to think maybe we're applying more common sense to the situation, when in fact we might just be jaded. And I think that's the caution I would give to my generation on this topic. I know you've seen it. I know you probably have been taken advantage of. You've helped people, just like you were saying before, that it didn't do any good. And so all those things enter into your mind, and we become jaded or blinded or uncaring toward those others when we really shouldn't. I think we have to guard against that.
This is where we have to become like little children, because children, they don't get caught in the mire of disappointment and so-called common sense, right? They have this easy sort of faith that doesn't, I don't want to say doesn't ask questions. If you know a kid, kids ask questions, but kids ask questions in faith that there are answers, right? That's different. It's not a doubtful sort of questioning. It's a genuine sort of curiosity, but it's not a sort of questioning that conveniently leads one to abdicate themselves of responsibility. Now, if you want to talk about being jaded, look at the Old Testament and how often the people of God turned on him, and then he would punish them, then they would come back and he would forgive them. And it happens over and over and over again. No one has better cause to be jaded than God. And yet, here we are, with the victory of Jesus Christ laid freely before us. So, if you want to be like God, that's what it means.
Yeah, so I think we hit on it briefly, but the question that the guy asked, who is my neighbor? That question really was asked not to get to the real answer. The question was asked to absolve himself of the responsibility. And so we need to be very careful of that. We need to, as you say, go back to being childlike in our questioning of really what is the real answer here. Not what is the answer that will allow me to go do what I want to do. And I think ultimately, hopefully that's what you and I are doing in these conversations, is let's ask sincere questions that get us to the truth, not to some predefined answer that we already know and we're going to use to our own advantage because we're selfish people by nature.
Right. Man, Jesus, he could see through people's questions.
Absolutely.
I mean, how many times when people came questioning him, did he see the intent of their hearts? He sees the intent of your heart too. And, with his help, you will be able to see the intent of your own heart and your evil devices, these evil tactics that we all employ to save ourselves, to save our egos, however you want to put it. Questioning is good, but I think it is better to err in a sort of excess, right? Let me explain what I mean. When it's time to help somebody, whether it be an expenditure of time, an expenditure of energy, even emotional energy, if that's a thing, expenditure of resources, whatever it is, if you're asking, is this too much? Do I need to take care of myself more or whatever? If you don't know the answer, then the question becomes, okay, which side is it better to err on? Is it better to err on the side of withholding or err on the side of giving too much? Is it better to err on the side of helping too few people or helping too many people? And I think you'll quickly arrive at the answer. There should be no room in the Christian life for a sort of analysis paralysis.
Well, I think the answer to that question, if we have friends that, a best friend, somebody who can speak into our life, the iron sharpens iron friend, then that person can tell us, hey, you need to take some time for yourself. You're burning yourself out. You need some time to retreat and spend just some alone time with God, or just get away for a few days and refuel. I think friends are very good for that because I have friends that do that for me. I do that for them. You can kind of see when people are getting stressed out and overextended.
Yep.
And so we need those types of friends as well in doing this.
Yeah, but be careful. Be careful. Because those same friends can sometimes hold you back. And this is why you need to be careful with your selection of friends, because if you start living Christ more genuinely, and let's say your friend is not interested in that, that's going to cast their faith or their morality or whatever in a pretty bad light. Here's something you can do. Pursue Christ as hard as you possibly can. Grow in grace. Grow in your relationship with Christ. And those friends around you that encourage you and push you up into that, those are your real friends. The friends who say, you're getting a little spooky spiritual on me. You're coming off a little bit like a Jesus freak. Like, you need to tone it back a little bit. Those are the people who are probably not your friends, who are probably not ultimately going to be a very good influence on you.
But is that not contradictory a little bit to the iron sharpens iron? I mean, I think there is a point in time when somebody needs to pull us back in. Maybe not. I think we need to be, careful about that. I get what you're saying, but we can become blind to things that we need to be aware of. Sometimes when we're serving Jesus, we can be doing harm either to ourselves or to other people in our life without understanding it. maybe we are neglecting our wife, we're neglecting our kids in the name of serving others, in the name of Jesus. And maybe we have a friend that says, hey, you need to reel it back in a little bit. Okay, so I would just say there are some circumstances where, that's the kind of friends that we need that will pull us back. We just have to be connected spiritually and on the same page. And I think, quite honestly, there's a give and take there, right? It's something we need to be able to have an open conversation about, just like we're doing right now, as far as, okay, is it really over the line or is it not? And if you have a true friend, y'all can have that kind of conversation trying to get to the truth, and you can push back on one another. So that's the kind of relationship I think you should have. Just because somebody's trying to pull you back from being a Jesus freak, they might be right? As long as you're on the same page of, being a Christian is a radical position.
Well, I want to hang on that word radical for a minute, because I've always struggled with that word. I acknowledge what you said earlier, that if you truly live out the word, you will live a radical lifestyle. But I don't like the idea of being radical for the sake of being radical. I think that genuine Christianity does not make a show of itself. Now, I think what you're talking about, the things that a good friend will pull us back from, we could call it a sort of religious fanaticism, right? Sometimes we can do radical things for the sake of appearing radical. Does that make sense? And we may say, well, I'm just being radical for Jesus, rather than a sort of simple, humble obedience. To answer your point, yes, friends will sometimes pull us back. The question is, are they pulling us away from something lesser and towards something better? Are they pulling us away from something better and towards something lesser? The answer to that question will depend on the quality of the person, and that's why you need to be so judicious in choosing who's going to reside in your inner circle.
I think the idea of being radical, to me, being radical for the sake of being radical would go against, back to Philippians chapter 2, what Jesus said in that passage I was quoting earlier. It said that he humbled himself and made himself of no reputation. So he wasn't trying to be something. He was simply here to serve. Jesus, who thought it not robbery to be equal with God, he literally stepped out of heaven. How big of a reputation? That's about as big of a reputation as you could get.
Yeah.
Paul gave us the same example. Paul was high in the religious circles, and he said, basically, I count all that as dung. I don't care about the status. I don't care about the power. I don't care about the prominence in men's eyes. I am here to preach Christ. And so, pride is a deceitful thing. It can slip in there. I think friends can help us identify pride. Good friends keep us humble. And so I think that's valuable when we're talking about pulling us back.
Yeah. I'll tell you a word that I'm more comfortable with than radical. The word peculiar, right? I always tend to default towards the more biblical language. Yes, it's as you say. It's being of no reputation, right?
Right.
Yeah, even in the early church, there were those who would make a name for themselves, right? Through the name of Christ. That's not what we're about. But if someone looks sideways at you, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
And we have to be real careful about that reputation thing because, even in the New Testament, as you were saying, that came to mind, there were some that would said, I'm of Paul, and some said, I'm of Apollos. Right. People want to migrate into groups.
I am of Calvin.
Yeah. And so,
That's made a few people upset.
we want to identify ourselves with people like that when really the only person we need to be identifying with is Christ.
Right.
We need to look like Christ.
Right. So we've talked a lot about loving friends, casting a wide net, in the sense of who is my neighbor? Well, we're rephrasing the question to be, who is my friend? Well, I think that we've made the case here that it's probably way more people than we in our natural state would like. Now, in regards to the question of loving your neighbor, Jesus had this to say. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. And
don't we hate it when Jesus says stuff like that?
And the net just gets wider and wider and wider until it encompasses the whole world. We don't really have time to get into all of that today, but we are excited to dive into the topic of loving your enemies, as well as some really practical issues of friendship in our next episode.
You think we could get Republicans and Democrats to watch our next episode as we dig into that?
They might need to with the election coming up. But until further notice, thank you so much for joining us. Please join us for our next episode where we're going to be continuing this conversation on friendship. If you found this podcast helpful or encouraging, please share it with a friend or give us a high rating. We hope that it has helped you to live out the word in your friendships as always. Until next time, God bless you.